What if I told you that everything you believed in was a lie? For a long time, the history of great geographical discoveries concealed a harsh pragmatism that was far removed from noble scientific endeavor.
Ships dropped anchor in a shallow bay and landed an armed detachment on the sandy beach.
The soldiers immediately began unloading heavy artillery and provisions under the scorching tropical sun. The expedition commanders immediately began to assess the surrounding landscape in terms of defense and access to fresh water.
The conquest of new lands was a complex logistical and military operation in which strategic calculation prevailed over random luck.
Watch the video to the end to find out how a desperate expedition managed to break the most powerful state on the continent through a series of tactical decisions and engineering maneuvers. Are you ready to learn the truth about the expedition's first steps on an unknown shore? The first task was to build a fortified base according to the strict rules of classical military engineering. The detachment dug a deep moat and piled up an earthen rampart, forming a perfect square to protect the perimeter. This camp construction scheme was strikingly reminiscent of ancient Roman forts. Inside the protected area, they set up command tents and placed cannons to control the approaches. The construction of the base was an open demonstration of intent to local observers. Every action of the soldiers was subject to strict discipline and a pre-approved plan. Wooden palisades quickly rose above the ground, turning the temporary camp into a reliable stronghold.
Shipwrights assembled massive gates from heavy planks, further reinforcing them with iron strips.
Every morning at the fort began with a thorough inspection of equipment and a full roll call of personnel. Officers carefully inspected the condition of steel cuirasses, crossbows, and long pikes. Any rust that appeared was immediately scraped off with river sand, and the trigger mechanisms were lubricated with grease. Serviceable weapons remained the main guarantee of survival in conditions of complete strategic uncertainty. The decision to destroy their own ships cut off any way for the detachment to return. The ships were deliberately run aground, and their rigging was transferred to warehouses inside the fortress.
This radical strategic move left the expedition with only one possible direction to go: forward.
The wooden hulls of the ships were methodically dismantled for useful building materials for the camp. The army was fully prepared to advance deep into the unknown and vast continent. All the supplies collected were strictly distributed among special porters and pack animals. We are very interested in hearing your opinion. What do you think about such a radical method of motivation as destroying your own fleet? Write about it in the comments and be sure to subscribe to our channel. Guess what happened next? The detachment left the fort protected by the coast and began a difficult advance into the interior of the continent. The route lay through dense jungles, which gradually gave way to steep, rocky ascents. The climatic conditions changed with every kilometer, forcing people to expend enormous effort to adapt. Moving artillery across a rough terrain became an exhausting ordeal for the entire expedition.
Soldiers in heavy metal armor suffered from the unbearable heat in open areas of the route.
The road required constant attention, as narrow paths often ended abruptly over deep precipices. Engineering teams had to widen the passages on the fly, cutting down obstructing rock ledges. The pace of movement was extremely slow, but the detachment stubbornly maintained strict marching order. The approach to the mountain ranges brought new difficulties in the form of sharp drops in nighttime temperatures. The air became thin, making it very difficult to breathe during constant physical exertion. To overcome wide gorges, the soldiers used their skills in building temporary suspension structures. They used strong tree trunks and sturdy ropes taken from dismantled ships. The constant tension and harsh conditions of survival tested the discipline within the detachment. Commanders suppressed any signs of discontent, reminding them that there was no turning back. Food supplies gradually dwindled, forcing the troops to switch to a strict economy regime. Hunting in unfamiliar forests did not always bring the expected results due to the secretive nature of the local fauna. Crossing the highest point of the pass was a turning point in the entire difficult march. A vast valley covered with a dense network of settlements and agricultural land opened up before the expedition. This view confirmed the correctness of the chosen direction and the scale of the upcoming campaign.
The descent into the valley required no less caution
than the long ascent that preceded it.
Leaving the mountains marked the end of the first stage of this massive logistical operation. Do you think modern armies could have completed this route without heavy equipment? In the next chapter, you will learn a secret that will change your life and your understanding of their future political alliances. A secret passed down from generation to generation. Advancing through the populated valley led to inevitable contact with local independent states. The first meetings were full of mutual distrust in attempts to assess each other's combat potential. The expedition demonstrated the power of its weapons in several short but extremely fierce skirmishes. This forced the leaders of the local entities to reconsider their attitude towards the arriving detachment. The expedition commanders quickly realized that the empire they were facing was held together by the subjugation of neighboring peoples. They began to play a subtle diplomatic game, revealing hidden conflicts within this vast region. Negotiations were conducted through interpreters, who carefully chose their words to create the desired impression.
The proposal for a military alliance against a common dominant enemy was met with an enthusiastic response.
The formation of the coalition radically changed the balance of power in the unfolding large-scale conflict. A small detachment of foreigners suddenly gained the support of thousands of disciplined and motivated allies. These new forces provided the expedition with uninterrupted supplies of fresh food and valuable intelligence. This political maneuver deprived the capital of its main buffer zones and loyal vassals. News of the approach of a huge coalition army reached the palace, causing serious confusion there. The rulers of the empire realized that the threat came not only from a small group of foreigners who had arrived. Internal division proved to be a much more powerful weapon than steel swords and firearms. The advance of the combined forces was accompanied by new cities joining the growing large-scale uprising. Each day brought new resources to the coalition and increased the size of the advancing army.
Engineering units worked tirelessly to widen the roads for the passage of heavy artillery wagons.
Bridges were reinforced with additional supports to withstand the continuous flow of marching people. The creation of this coalition was a masterpiece of manipulation and pragmatic calculation in the history of conquest. Appreciate this complex strategic move and be sure to like this video. Something you've never seen before. The capital of the empire was an architectural marvel, located on islands in the middle of a huge salt lake. Access to the city was provided by a system of wide artificial dams laid directly across the water. These dams were not just roads, but complex hydraulic structures with drawbridges. The expedition commanders immediately appreciated both the grandeur of this place and its potential danger. Progress along the dams was slow and accompanied by thousands of glances from local residents on boats. Every step along the narrow strip of land made the army extremely vulnerable to a possible flank attack. The expedition's engineers recorded the location of bridges and the width of canals for future tactical analysis. They understood that in the event of conflict, these dams would be the only routes to safety. The apparent hospitality concealed growing political and social tensions in the metropolis. The expedition found itself effectively trapped on the island, surrounded by hundreds of thousands of potential enemies. The logistics of food supplies depended entirely on the goodwill of local rulers. Any sudden change in mood could instantly turn the palace into a deadly stone trap. The commanders began to develop plans in case of a sudden armed conflict within the city. Routes of retreat to the dams and possible breakthrough points in the defensive lines were identified. Soldiers were strictly forbidden to leave the palace grounds without orders and an escort. Discipline became the only factor preventing the detachment from disintegrating in a hostile environment. An examination of the city's resources revealed vast reserves of gold and precious stones. However, this metal had no practical value for the immediate survival of the garrison. The city went about its usual business, but the presence of armed foreigners disrupted the centuries-old balance. Merchants in the markets increasingly glanced anxiously toward the fortified palace. The empire's power seemed unshakable, but a crack in the foundation of control had already begun to widen rapidly. The detachment was at the epicenter of a looming geopolitical storm. The study of the city's architecture led to an understanding of its profound strategic vulnerability. Are you ready to find out how this architectural trap snapped shut? Realizing the precariousness of their position, the expedition commanders decided on an unprecedentedly bold tactical move. During another diplomatic visit, the emperor was captured and placed under house arrest. This action paralyzed the usual system of government of the vast state for several critical weeks. The Palace of the Foreigners became the new hidden center of political and military decision-making. Immediately after the ruler's capture, security measures inside the palace were significantly tightened. Engineering teams began to reinforce window openings and erect additional barricades in the corridors. Wooden beams were torn from the floors and used to create powerful defensive shields. Each room was turned into an isolated redoubt in case the outer perimeter of the defense was breached. The markets around the palace began to rapidly empty, foreshadowing the imminent cessation of regular food supplies. Supply logistics failed, forcing the garrison to switch to strict rationing of its remaining reserves. Water from the palace wells was rationed, as access to external aqueducts could be cut off. The siege had effectively begun even before the first shot was fired. Officers developed detailed plans for conducting combat in the confined space of the palace rooms. Mobile reserve groups were created to quickly reinforce the most dangerous areas of the breach. The palace walls were breached in the necessary places to create hidden loopholes and embrasures. The architecture of the building was completely subordinated to the inexorable laws of European siege engineering. Attempts to use the authority of the captured ruler to calm the crowd became less and less effective. His orders were ignored by the local aristocracy, which began to form new centers of power. The city methodically prepared for a forceful solution to the problem of the presence of armed foreigners. Local warriors concentrated in neighboring quarters, blocking all possible routes of covert retreat. Control of the situation was finally slipping out of the hands of the isolated expedition's command. Gunpowder supplies were counted daily, as it was absolutely impossible to replenish them under blockade conditions. The palace had turned into a powder keg, ready to explode from any insignificant spark. The moment of open and uncompromising confrontation was approaching, with frightening and inevitable speed. The realization of the inevitability of a full-scale crisis forced the engineers to revise their evacuation plans. Developing mechanisms for a breakthrough became the main and only task for the survival of the entire garrison. An experiment that did not go according to plan. During a major city festival, one of the expedition commanders made a fatal tactical decision. Fearing a hidden conspiracy, he ordered a preemptive strike against the aristocracy gathered in the square. This action led to the instant collapse of all fragile diplomatic agreements and political restraints. The city, which had previously maintained a tense neutrality, exploded into a fierce and large-scale uprising. Crowds of armed townspeople poured toward the fortified palace, completely blocking the adjacent wide streets. Archers appeared on the roofs of neighboring buildings, methodically pelting the courtyard with heavy stones. The siege entered an active phase, requiring the garrison to mobilize all its remaining physical strength. The expedition's cannons opened continuous fire, punching wide gaps in the advancing dense ranks. However, the numerical superiority of the besiegers was so great that the artillery volleys did not stop the assault. The palace shook from the constant blows of battering rams against the massive iron-bound wooden gates. Engineering teams barely managed to repair the destroyed barricades under a continuous hail of projectiles. The logistics of the defense collapsed as movement across the open courtyards became impossible. The captured ruler had finally lost his status and influence over the raging city mob. His attempt to stop the uprising from the roof of the palace ended in tragic failure and the loss of their leader. This moment became the point of no return, after which negotiations became absolutely impossible for both sides. Power in the city passed entirely to radical military leaders who wanted to totally destroy the foreigners. The garrison found itself in a critical situation, deprived of access to fresh water and new food supplies. The aqueducts that supplied the palace were destroyed by the besiegers in the first hours of the armed uprising. The soldiers had to dig deep wells right into the stone floor of the interior rooms. The brackish water they found barely sustained life, but could not quench their constant, exhausting thirst. The gold collected by the expedition became a heavy burden in anticipation of the planned night retreat. The command allowed the soldiers to take as much precious metal as they could carry. This freedom of choice proved to be a fatal mistake, significantly increasing the weight of each individual infantryman. Overloaded, the men lost the mobility that was critical to successfully overcoming the trap. The balance of power finally shifted in favor of the besiegers, leaving the garrison with no choice but to flee. Want to know how they tried to escape from this deadly stone trap under the cover of night? The night of the breakout was unusually dark and accompanied by heavy rain, which concealed the movements of the troops. The detachment left the ruined palace silently, trying not to attract the attention of the vigilant sentries on the neighboring roofs. The vanguard carried heavy wooden bridges, specially designed to span the destroyed spans of the main dam. The dense column moved along a narrow strip of land, surrounded on all sides by black lake water. Reaching the first breach in the dam, the engineers quickly installed a portable bridge in the incessant rain. The artillery and horses began a slow advance across the slippery planks, risking falling into the abyss. However, the alarm was raised, and the silence of the night was broken by the sounds of signal drums and shouts. The lake around the dam was instantly filled with hundreds of boats carrying armed local warriors. The second breach in the dam had to be crossed by swimming, clinging to pieces of wood and floating horses. The chaos grew, the cries of the drowning mingling with the sounds of incessant rain and the blows of wooden oars. The command completely lost control of the disorganized army, which stretched for miles. The structure of the detachment dissolved in the darkness of the night, leaving only the instinct for self-preservation as a guide. To cross to the next section, the soldiers used abandoned carts and property as makeshift flooring. This section of the route became a symbol of complete strategic failure and the loss of all accumulated material resources. The artillery, the pride of the expedition, was left forever at the bottom of a deep salt lake. Firearms were rendered useless by moisture, depriving the survivors of their main technological advantage. Dawn revealed the true scale of the logistical and military disaster that had occurred on the dams during the night. Only a small part of the original powerful and confident expedition reached the shore. The people were extremely exhausted, deprived of weapons, provisions, and reliable protective equipment. They found themselves in enemy territory, vulnerable and demoralized by an unprecedented tactical defeat. The remnants of the detachment were forced to immediately continue their relentless march away from the capital. Survival in harsh conditions required the mobilization of the last internal reserves of the body. The lack of medicine and food exacerbated the situation of the retreating troops with every kilometer they traveled. Engineers had to reinvent ways of starting fires without the usual flint and dry tinder. The retreat was a harsh lesson that proved the vulnerability of even the most perfect military machine. The illusion of complete control over the situation was brutally shattered by the harsh reality of geography and numerical superiority. The expedition lost everything it had fought so long and hard to achieve on its journey across the continent. The stakes had reached their peak, leaving only the bare physical survival of the people at stake. That night went down in history as a turning point in the entire large-scale conquest campaign. The survivors began the long journey to Allied territories to comprehend the structural collapse that had occurred. While the remnants of the expedition struggled to recover their strength among the Allies, another tragedy was unfolding in the capital. Along with the foreigners, an invisible threat had entered the city, against which the local population had no defense. An epidemic of an unknown disease began to rapidly and mercilessly devastate the densely populated urban districts of the metropolis. This factor suddenly and radically changed the strategic balance of power throughout the vast region. The disease spread through the streets, paralyzing the markets and disrupting the usual supply logistics. The once bustling squares became deserted, and the city's management system began to experience serious organizational failures. The commanders of the city's units were dropping out en masse, depriving the army of experienced and authoritative leadership. The defenders of the capital were weakening, losing their ability to organize an effective and long-term defense. The training of Allied troops reached a whole new level of cooperation and strict discipline. Linear combat tactics were introduced, using long spears to counter massive attacks. Workshops worked around the clock, forging new steel tips and repairing cuirasses damaged in battle. The logistics of supplying provisions were reorganized to provide for the huge army for months to come. The epidemic in the capital continued its destructive work, methodically undermining the foundations of the great empire. The shortage of labor led to the silting up of vital canals and the partial collapse of some hydraulic structures. The city's defenders were in a state of permanent crisis, trying to fight an invisible and relentless enemy. The resources of the metropolis were dwindling, with no possibility of replenishment due to the political blockade by the Allies. The expedition, on the contrary, was restoring its technological and structural power with each passing day. Intelligence reported empty streets in the capital and reduced activity by sentries on distant embankments. This information allowed the command to accurately calculate the time for the final strategic strike. Preparations for the campaign proceeded with cold calculation and a complete understanding of the new rules of warfare. The psychological advantage had now completely shifted to the side of the united army of reformers. The realization that the capital was weakening from within gave confidence in planning complex engineering operations. Every element of the future offensive was rehearsed to perfection at specially created training grounds. No detail was to lead to a repeat of the fatal mistakes of the past retreat. This pause in active combat became a decisive factor in the entire protracted conflict. It allowed the expedition to transform from a fleeing detachment into an organized siege machine. The Empire, meanwhile, lost its main advantage, the sheer number of active and healthy defenders. The stage was set for the final and uncompromising act of this historical drama. The scale of the threat changed, shifting from open confrontation to a grueling war of attrition. For the final blow, the expedition implemented a project that was unprecedented in the history of military logistics. Far away in the mountains, engineers designed and built a fleet of 13 collapsible sailing and rowing brigantines. The parts of these ships were carefully numbered and fitted together with perfect carpentry precision. This solution made it possible to transport the ship components across rough terrain directly to the shores of the Salt Lake. Transporting the dismantled fleet was an unprecedented logistical operation that lasted several tense weeks. Thousands of porters carried heavy oak frames, masts, and rigging across winding mountain passes. The convoy was guarded by reinforced troops, ready to thwart any attempt at sabotage on this strategic route. Engineers supervised the process, ensuring the safety of every critical wooden component. A fortified assembly dock was erected on the shore of the lake, securely protected by a system of moats and palisades. Shipwrights began assembling the brigantines, sealing the seams with boiling resin and tow. An artillery position was installed at the bow of each ship, turning them into floating assault batteries. The speed of assembly was astonishing, demonstrating the highest level of European technological organization. The dams, which had previously served as retreat routes, now became vectors for a systematic and inevitable advance. At each narrow section, engineers erected mobile wooden shields to protect against projectiles. Cannons methodically destroyed the barricades of the besieged, clearing the way for the advance of heavy assault infantry. Step by step, the coalition gained ground, tightening the ring around the exhausted, enormous city. The city found itself in the grip of an impenetrable blockade, deprived of any hope of outside support. The defenders' resources were dwindling, while the pressure on the perimeter of the defenses increased daily. The coalition was in no hurry to launch the final assault, preferring to wear down the enemy by methodically destroying the infrastructure. Engineering ingenuity turned the lake into the perfect arena for the systematic destruction of a centuries-old state. The preparations culminated in the creation of ideal conditions for the transition to the final stage of the large-scale operation. The fall of the Great Empire was not an instantaneous event, but a process of long and methodical dismantling of infrastructure. The coalition army advanced deep into the capital, destroying buildings block by block, quarter by quarter. Engineers ordered the water channels to be filled with debris from destroyed palaces to create wide passages. This tactic allowed heavy artillery and cavalry to be moved safely right into the center of the metropolis. With each canal filled in, the city lost its unique architectural identity and defensive potential. Spacious squares were turned into staging areas for the advancing Allied army's fortified camps. The defenders retreated deeper into the islands, losing control of strategically important markets and administrative buildings. The defense system disintegrated into isolated pockets of resistance, deprived of a unified command center. The surrender of the last rulers of the empire marked the formal end of this brutal logistical and military campaign. Power was transferred to the commanders of the expedition amid the ruins of what was once the most magnificent city on the continent. The scale of the changes that had taken place astonished even the victors themselves, who realized the grandeur of the historical task they had accomplished. The enormous political system had been completely dismantled and prepared for integration into a new reality. The silence that followed the siege was as heavy as the preceding months of continuous fighting. Engineering brigades immediately began clearing the rubble and planning the streets for the new colonial center. The remains of ancient architecture were methodically recycled into building materials for the construction of European administrative buildings. The past was being erased from the face of the earth, giving way to the pragmatism of a new geopolitical world order. The expedition's victory was not an accident or the result of mythical prophecies, as legends often claim. It was the result of cold calculation, adaptation to harsh conditions of survival, and brilliant logistical organization. Siege technology proved more effective than the disorganized resistance armies of a fragmented empire, numbering in the thousands. The conquest was a cruel triumph of pragmatism, over the established traditions of an isolated vast continent. The events of those days left a deep and indelible mark on the formation of the modern map of our world. We can see that this conquest was not simply a quest for mythical riches, but a complex engineering and political operation. Control over logistics, the creation of unthinkable alliances, and the ruthless exploitation of infrastructure vulnerabilities determined the outcome of this campaign. Every barricade erected, every ship assembled, and every canal filled in were tools in the hands of a cold and methodical strategy. History has shown that it was not only swords that brought down the empire, but also superiority and pragmatic calculation. Which stage of this massive fall do you think was the most decisive factor in the end? Share your thoughts and be sure to suggest topics for future historical videos in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our new in-depth research.